Episode 8, Rituals of Despair. The air inside the cave grew colder, more oppressive, as the towering figure of the Hollow Man loomed before Evelyn and Lucas. The jagged fissure in the ground seemed like a wound torn in the earth itself, and from its depths, an unholy darkness seeped into the chamber, corrupting the ancient air. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing as the weight of their failure settled on her shoulders. They had come so close, but something had gone wrong. The Hollow Man was not just a legend, they had summoned him, unshackled and enraged. Lucas stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror as the Hollow Man's glowing eyes locked onto them. The figure's shadowy form writhed, as though barely contained by the space around it. Its body, though undefined, seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, flickering in and out of focus like a nightmare just beyond the edge of perception. "We need to go," Lucas shouted, his voice thick with fear. "Now." But Evelyn couldn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the Hollow Man, and in that moment, something strange happened. The whispers that had haunted them since they entered the forest grew louder, clearer, and Evelyn realized they weren't random voices, they were calling her name. She staggered, her mind reeling. The shadows were speaking to her, drawing her in. "Evelyn," Lucas grabbed her arm, shaking her from her stupor. "Snap out of it. We have to get out of here before it's too late." The cave shook again, the very stones groaning in protest as the Hollow Man stepped closer. Its presence was overwhelming, like a black hole, pulling everything into its void. Evelyn felt her strength draining, her mind clouding with dread. But then, through the haze of fear, something clicked in her memory, a fragment of her father's notes, written hastily in the margins of his book. He had spoken of the Hollow Man, but more importantly, of a way to bind him. "The runes," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't finish the ritual correctly, but there's another way." Lucas looked at her, desperation in his eyes. "What do you mean? How do we stop this thing?" Evelyn glanced at the glowing runes on the altar, her mind racing. The Hollow Man had been summoned, but he wasn't fully free, yet. The ritual they had performed had partially opened the gate, but if they could reverse it, if they could bind him again, they might be able to stop him from escaping fully into their world. "There's another spell," she said, her voice steadying. "We can bind him here, in this cave. We just need to finish the sequence." The Hollow Man growled a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. Its glowing eyes narrowed as if sensing their intentions. "We don't have time, Evelyn," Lucas urged, fear gripping his voice. But Evelyn was already moving, her fingers tracing the remaining runes on the altar. They had missed one, a critical piece of the puzzle. The final rune wasn't a symbol of the elements like the others. It was something older, more primal. A binding rune, hidden in the ancient texts her father had studied. "I can do this," Evelyn whispered, half to herself and half to Lucas. "I can finish the spell." Lucas stood by her side, his fear giving way to grim determination. "What do you need me to do?" Evelyn's eyes locked onto his. "Stay with me. No matter what happens, we can't leave this cave until the Hollow Man is bound." The cave shook violently as the Hollow Man advanced, its shadowy form shifting and twisting, growing larger with each passing second. Time was running out. Evelyn knelt before the altar, her hands shaking as she reached for the final rune. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her, the Hollow Man's gaze burning into her back. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the words her father had written. As she placed her hand on the binding rune, the cave trembled again, and the runes began to glow brighter, their light filling the chamber with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Evelyn closed her eyes and began to speak, reciting the binding spell in a language that felt both familiar and alien on her tongue. The words flowed from her lips, ancient and powerful, reverberating through the cave. The Hollow Man let out a roar, a sound so primal and filled with rage that it made the ground beneath them quake. But Evelyn didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The ritual had begun, and it was the only thing standing between them and the creature's full release. As she chanted, the shadows around the cave seemed to writhe in agony, pulling away from the Hollow Man's form. The glowing runes pulsed, growing brighter and brighter with each word she spoke. Lucas watched in awe as the Hollow Man began to weaken, its form flickering as if being pulled back into the fissure from which it had risen, but the ritual wasn't over yet. The binding spell required more than just words, it required a sacrifice. Evelyn's voice faltered as she realized what the final step was. In her father's notes, he had written about the price of binding the Hollow Man. A life for a life. The curse could only be contained through blood. Lucas saw the look in her eyes, and knew immediately what she was thinking. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Evelyn whispered, her heart sinking. "One of us has to stay." The Hollow Man let out another roar, its form continuing to flicker, but the shadows were closing in again. The binding spell was working, but only barely. Without the final sacrifice, the Hollow Man would break free. "Go," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "You have to get out of here." "I'm not leaving you," Lucas shouted, grabbing her arm, but Evelyn shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "This is the only way, Lucas. If you stay, we both die. You have to leave now." Lucas's grip tightened, but he knew she was right. The cave trembled again, the fissure widening as the Hollow Man's form grew unstable. Time was running out, and they both knew it. With a heavy heart, Lucas nodded. "I'll come back for you," he whispered. Evelyn forced a smile, though her heart ached with the weight of what was to come. "Go." As Lucas turned and ran, the shadows closed in around her, but Evelyn didn't waver. She placed her hand on the final rune, her voice steady as she spoke the last words of the binding spell. The Hollow Man screamed, a sound filled with rage and agony as the binding rune flared to life. The cave shook violently, the ground cracking beneath Evelyn's feet as the Hollow Man was pulled back into the fissure, its form dissolving into the darkness. And then, there was silence. The Hollow Man was bound once again, but the price had been paid. Evelyn stood alone in the cave, the glowing runes dimming as the spell completed. She knew she would never leave this place, but the curse was contained. For now. End of episode 8.